Hello everybody, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Megan Rowling. I am the editor of Zilient.org and also a journalist with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. As you'll know, if you're a regular reader of Zilient, we write a lot of news, feature stories about cities and how to make them safer, greener and cleaner places for residents around the world. So this month for our Zilient live discussion, we thought we would throw ahead to a big event happening in New York next month, which is the high-level political forum from July the 9th to the 18th. It does sound rather grand, but besides the ministers' meeting towards the end, there'll be a lot going on with different organisations talking about what they're doing to help meet the Sustainable Development Goals, several of which will be up for review at that forum. Now, one of those goals is Goal 11, which is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. And the theme of the whole event will be transformation towards sustainable and resilient societies. So today we'll be trying to discuss those topics in more concrete terms and giving you a look at what some of the main players in the space are doing to help cities actually get on track to achieve the global goals, and in doing so, help push the rest of the world to the finish line by 2030 as planned. And to talk about these issues today, we've got some very experienced urban experts. I'll introduce them quickly and then we'll hear from each of them before going to a Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question, please add it to the chat if you're joining us on Zoom, or if you're watching on Facebook, put it in the comment box. And if you're tweeting, the main hashtags we'll be using today are HLPF 2018, hashtag SDG11 and hashtag Resilient Cities. So today we're going to hear first from Aziza Akhmouch, who heads the Cities, Urban Policies and Sustainable Development Division at the OECD Centre for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. She oversees a range of urban-related policies with the aim of advising governments on public policy design and implementation. She also has responsibility for innovative networks such as the OECD Champion Mayors Initiative for Inclusive Growth and the Water Governance Initiative. Then we'll be speaking to Laurie Manderino, who is Associate Director at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, in New York. She has more than 20 years of experience related to sustainable development and has worked at the OECD as well as an environmental finance consultant. And she spent 5 years in Africa as country director of the US Peace Corps in Benin and head of a pediatric HIV/AIDS program in Rwanda. Then we'll be talking also to Santiago Uribe Rocha, who is Chief Resilience Officer for the city of Medellín in Colombia. He was appointed, in fact, as the second Chief Resilience Officer, or CRO as they're known, in the 100 Resilient Cities Network, and he's now been doing the job for about 4 years. Before that, he worked for the government in the Colombian embassy in South Africa, and he led exchanges there with top-level officials to share experiences of peace and reconciliation processes, and he's also worked on child rights and with youth. So welcome to all of our experts. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. So Aziza, I'm going to go to you first. I think what everybody would probably like to know before we go down to the nitty-gritty is, why is it important to engage cities in meeting these sustainable development goals? Why is their role so important?
Thank you very much, Megan, for the invitation. We're very happy to be part of this webinar and basically to address your question. I think that if we look back at the MDGs and the Millennium Development Goals, there were three main lessons that were taken that I think shaped or contributed to shape very nicely the SDGs. The first one is that the agenda for the Millennium Development Goals was very much an agenda for the West and the rest, and the idea that it was mainly about rich countries contributing to helping developing countries catch up. And I think what the SDGs, with their universal lens, are actually emphasizing is that it's no longer the West and the rest. Even advanced economies, OECD countries that have high GDP per capita, universal coverage and so on, have not fixed the magnitude of their challenges, and where most of these challenges are actually impacting today is in cities, which is where most people actually live and work. The second message was that the reporting and the way we've been tracking progress on the MDGs was somewhat misleading because we were looking at national average. And this national average that was telling us whether a country was on track or not was also masking huge disparities that we know are much more important within countries than across countries. And there, it's very important to go more granular and to see actually how these different dimensions of well-being and sustainable development materialize in the places. And we see also cities being the greatest hosts of inequalities and a number of problems related to infrastructure and so on. And so going granular is very important, and going local is absolutely important to tell the true story, which is whether a country is actually up to the levels or not. And then the last one was that the previous agenda was very much focusing on the top-down logics where national governments decided what the goals were, and then local governments were called upon to make it happen. And I think the way the SDG agenda was designed is a bit the other way around, also consulting local and regional governments that are responsible for many of the policies that are underlying the Sustainable Development Goals. And we know that almost 2/3 of these targets are not going to be achieved without the implication of cities and regions. So that's a bit of the background for us stepping into that bridge and making the case to our constituencies at OECD that are national governments, that they need to materialize concretely this shared responsibility with cities and regions if they want to reach the goals by the coming 15 years. And to be very concrete, this means, and that's what we are doing now within the OECD program on a territorial approach to the SDGs, addressing three big elephants in the room. The first one is how cities and regions can use the SDGs to step back, reshape, think about how they design their local policies, planning, strategies, investments. The second one is how we can measure where cities actually stand vis-à-vis their national average, but also against each other's. And we have there a huge data set at the OECD that is comparing socioeconomic and environmental indicators across 280 metropolitan areas globally, and more than 2,000 regions as this intermediary level of government. And the third one is to see how we can go beyond anecdotal cases that we know are happening in cities. There are the laboratories of innovation, to have something that can be replicated, upscaled, extended, and that can really help reach a critical mass. So we are working in these areas, and to wrap up with the third and last block of my presentation, we've been working very closely with 5 pilots in particular at regional and city level, and we see very interesting things happening. We see in Germany, for example, the development with foundations and other players of local SDG indicators. We see structures such as Engagement Global and BNZ supporting cities within their country and not only through their decentralized development cooperation. We see innovative mechanisms such as a German Sustainability Award that is framed along the SDGs and that can set a very nice incentive. We have other cases like Denmark, where statistical offices across levels of government are discussing concretely now how we can localize the measurement to guide better action. We have an interesting example in the region of South Denmark, where they're completely reshaping their regional development strategy based on the SDGs, being an economic and development lens. Regions like Flanders in Belgium have their vision to 2030 shaped around the SDGs. They have revisited their participatory governance models along these lines. We have the city of Kitakyushu in Japan that has put a very strong emphasis on the environmental lens of SDGs because they see it really as a priority area to target, to fix the other SDGs, and a very nice mechanism that is called an SDG promotion headquarter that is meant to coordinate across levels of government and across ministerial departments. And even cities and countries and regions, like Cordoba in Argentina, have completely stepped back and started to reshape their survey to households to include questions and data that can help them track ex post whether how they're doing with the SDGs. So we see a lot of these innovations. We think that a lot is happening at subnational level, and really for us the stake is to facilitate the uptake of these innovations into what can become a critical mass that can help local and national decision makers guide these decisions. So I'll stop here because I think that the Q&A will be very interesting also in the second part of the webinar, and happy to say a bit more.
Thank you, Aziza. Yes, that's very informative. Two things that you said struck me. One was the very large role that cities are going to have to play if we are going to meet the SDGs. I think you said it's somewhere around 2/3 of the SDGs they are responsible for achieving, and that is a really high number that may surprise people. And secondly, that there's a lot going on in what we would refer to as perhaps richer countries, the developed world. I think that maybe out there in the wider world there is probably a perspective that, you know, as with the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals are goals that, you know, apply perhaps more in developing countries, but it's interesting to see to what extent there is interest and innovation around the goals in Germany, in Denmark, and the other places that you mentioned. I just wondered if you could share a little bit more about how the OECD plans to share the learning from some of these initiatives with the Global South specifically.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, we see a very strong need to disentangle, but also to combine the internal and the external function of the SDGs. The internal function should be typically giving cities, regions, and countries of advanced economies an opportunity to acknowledge that their current levels of, you know, service delivery and public policies are not taken for granted. There are big threats related to mega trends, demography, aging, migration, but also digitalization and the future of work, also the transition to low carbon economy. So it's very important, and that's most of my presentation, because as OECD, we're the club of advanced economy, even if we work with over 100 countries, to raise the awareness of our members that they've got a bit of work to do, because public investment is shrinking, because infrastructure is aging and obsolete, and because they have these external threats that they need to address today to fit for the future. But then it's true there is an external function to the SDG, which is also what these economies can do to support the advancement of the goals in the Global South, as you said. And there we just released a very important piece of work on decentralized development cooperation, for example, which is every kind of development cooperation activity that one city or region from often a developed economy does with a city or region with developing countries. And you see, for example, that there is over $2 billion euros actually, or dollars, in 2015 that was extended through aid transiting through local and regional governments in the Global South. So official development assistance is playing a role, you know, to help cities ring-fence some revenues to help their peer cities in developing countries. But most importantly, there is a lot to be done in capacity building, in knowledge sharing, and so on. So in this work, we're going to facilitate really these three pillars, the forum and the policy discussion, because this is our job, to advise governments on public policies. We're not financing infrastructure, we don't regulate any sector, but we give evidence-based analysis guidance that can help all levels of government take the right decisions. So we're going to provide that information and that evidence base and set up those fora where we can really learn from what cities and in cooperation with their national governments are doing, and provide some, I would say, overarching standards based on the good practices to get the framework conditions right within and across cities and regions to deliver on that agenda for the North, but also for the Global South.
Thank you, Aziza. That's quite a big task you've got there ahead of you. Laurie Manderino from the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network in New York. Your organization, I think, is also aiming to support governments and cities in achieving the SDGs. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how your work has developed since you were set up and what tools you have in order to help policymakers get to the end goals.
Yes, thanks, Megan. Happy to do so, and also happy to join this webinar today. Thank you so much for including, as you do at Zilient, the different perspectives of the multilateral organization, us in the research and civil society space, and also a city working in these issues. So my organization, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, was started in 2012 by then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in the recognition of the fact that as we were transitioning and thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, which were ultimately passed in 2015, while we face these daunting challenges in the world related to climate and poverty and inequality, we also live in a time of tremendous innovation and technological breakthroughs. So we try and bring the research and technology and academic communities to bear on the SDG issues and challenges that we face as a global community. We're directed by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who's a well-known, world-renowned expert on sustainable development. And we have more than 800 universities in our global network that work locally and nationally and regionally and globally on these issues. So as you mentioned, I mean, the SDGs are overarching, meant to address environmental, economic, and social equality challenges. So we, in our role in bringing academic research and evidence-based analysis, we have developed some tools and thought about what kind of tools are helpful to see if countries are achieving what they set out and what they committed to do in 2015 with the SDGs. So we have put out a number of getting started guides for universities and for cities. And we also started doing these annual index reports. And perhaps I'll talk a little bit later about one that we do globally for more than 150 countries. But what I'll focus on now, as the topic is cities, a report that we recently published in June focused on US cities and what they are doing for the SDGs. You know, as Aziza already mentioned, a lot of this work is going to happen locally. That's where you can engage stakeholders, you can monitor local progress, and in the US context, 85% of the US population lives in cities. So here is our Leaving No US City Behind. It's the second annual report we've done. And you can see in the upper right there, we do a dashboard where we rate the 100 most populated US metropolitan areas on 15 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Because while we talk about Goal 11 on cities, really almost every one of the SDGs are very relevant to people living in cities, whether it's gender equality or energy or the hunger goal, Goal 2, we interpret more as a food and diet type of goal in the US context. So US cities were anxious for this type of a tool because there where a lot of the movement is happening on these issues. You see that red column to the right there, that is the climate action column. We feel that none of the 100 cities we rated in the US context are on track to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement and the commitment that was made there. So we are really highlighting that as an area for across the board needed action in the US context. In our global index, the US is a country ranked 42nd in 2017. So this really points to, you see the map there shows some of the geographic dispersions. That one happens to be for poverty rates. So we try and take a national perspective in this type of index. As Aziza mentioned, all of these issues are relevant to cities. And we hope that this report, as well as the Getting Started guide that we put out for cities, is an opportunity for peer-to-peer learning. That cities can look in the dashboard and see those cities that are green on certain goals and read this Getting Started guide and get a sense of how they might want to go about their own planning and look at their own sustainability plans in the SDG framework. We're fortunate to be supported by the Kresge Foundation in this work. And in this, I want to acknowledge my two co-authors on the US Index report, Jessica Espy and Hayden Dom.
Thanks for that, Laurie. I think that's a really good overview of you know, how things are looking in the US, and it just goes to show that there's still a lot of work to do, even in a, you know, one of the world's most wealthy and powerful countries, especially on things like climate action, which, you know, obviously is a fairly kind of controversial topic these days in the United States. And you're also bringing out the top level, the country level SDGs index as well. I think the 2018 version is coming out soon. I think probably in July, isn't it? And I noticed from last year's that you had sort of raised a red flag about nationalism, protectionism, and countries kind of putting themselves first, and saying that that could be a potential barrier to achievement of the SDGs. Is that something that we're seeing coming through again this time around? If you could give us a little sneak preview, if that's allowed.
Well, I mean, it's obvious we do live in a globalized world, an increasing globalized world. And one of the things we focused on in the 2017 global report that looks at countries is spillover impacts. What are the impacts of production and technology on climate spillovers, and even in the financial sector, spillovers per year? Because it's not just how the country is doing on their own, but how they're doing as a global citizen on these issues. And this year's report will focus on, particularly on the G20 countries. You know, we've talked about how the SDGs apply across the board to all levels of income. And 2/3 of the global population live in the G20 countries, and 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from there. So we're taking a look at what are the G20 countries doing in terms of political leadership and institutionalizing the goals and really making this part of their vision as a nation as to where they want to be in 2030. Are they putting together action plans, accountability mechanisms?
We look forward to reading more of that and seeing where the focus needs to be in the near term. I'm going to bring the discussion down to the city level now. If we have Santiago Uribe Rocha with us, the Chief Resilience Officer of Medellín in Colombia. I think that Santiago's had some issues joining by video, so we're going to hear from him on the telephone, which is, as long as we can hear his voice, that is what matters. Hello. Santiago, I wanted to ask you, Medellín in the past has had major issues with violence and social exclusion that perhaps fueled that violence. But I know that your work has been very much focused on overcoming some of those root causes. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how Medellín has evolved in the past decade in terms of its social resilience.
Hi, good morning, and sorry that I haven't been able to connect properly with the video and presentation, but I'm right now in a rural area because I'm taking part of a next level of peace negotiations in Colombia. And I was kind of worried that I was not able to make it, but I am here. So I don't know if the presentation is on now, but I can share it with every one of you. Just to answer your question on what is important, once we were we were nominated or selected as a part of 100 resilient cities. We asked ourselves, and I just want to let you know that when we proposed the city to be part of 100 resilient cities, out of 382 cities, Medellín was the only one that actually presented the city in terms of a social challenge, and that was clearly how Medellín thinks becoming a resilient city by facing the challenges and related to violence, especially urban violence and conflict. And it was really interesting because the older cities were all thinking about tsunamis, earthquakes, and natural issues. And of course, because of that, we taking the lead of thinking about how to bring a more stable, peaceful, and perhaps a more equal society. And what happened especially in 1991, when we realized, and we ended up being one of the most dangerous cities around the world with the highest rate of homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, exactly 391, we realized that violence wasn't the issue, that violence was actually the manifestation of bigger issues. And clearly we look at, and 3 decades ago, we didn't have the development goals and all the indices that we have right now, but we started to look at simple indicators of human development, economical development, social development. And clearly what we look at in Medellín is, and what we found out, it was a very well segregated society with a close to 70 or 72% of our population having very low indicators of social development in terms of education, cultural activities, access, health, transport. And with all of that, and with that analysis, clearly Medellín was able to understand that cities are beyond infrastructure, buildings, or transportation, but it's all about people. How can we bring better opportunities to people to reduce those inequalities? And at the time, we had a very clear understanding that the challenges of the city were related to the urban sprawl and informality, how the city grew so huge and rapidly without those neighborhoods getting access to basic services of transportation, health, culture, and education. All the issues related to economical and social inequities and inequalities. And later on, climate change and sustainability start to play a great deal in this process.
Yes, I was going to ask you about today. So I believe you did various interventions, such as making it far easier to travel from the suburbs to the city with a gondola, and putting in lots of cultural, sports and educational facilities. And I'm just wondering what you see as the key challenges today. I mean, Medellín has obviously made a huge amount of progress already in dealing with issues such as violence. What do you see as the key obstacles that you have to overcome in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yes, and as you say, after the city pays so much attention and focus on integrating or trying to integrate the society to new transport system, to building schools, cultural centers, as many as we could and with the best quality, we still have high indicators of inequality. We have been able to reduce violence, but with high levels of inequality. So we're looking at now into a more integrated perspective, and we thinking on trying to build inclusive economies. And when we start working with different institutions and working with some of them, the university or the USLA University, what inclusive economy means, and we understanding that it's all about growing, but better growing, also to be equitable, how cities could have equitable growing, but also more participation, social participation, people having access to new markets, to be proper consumer, business owners, to be able and to take part in decision making. Then creating a stable society where people have access to influence public policies, to be able to have an accountability in those public policies and in the regulations, but as well a space for dialogue where the city and the citizens can talk and be able to discuss about what future city we want to build. And finally, how can we make all this growth, equitable, stable, and participatory sustainable, all this process to become sustainable? Those are right now the challenges that we're facing, and thinking on the next step for Medellín to become a city that is able to meet the sustainable, the development sustainable goals for 2030, and participating in contributing to the country's goal in a more active way. Focusing right now in creating inclusive economies in a more integrated way, not just in growth and economic growth, but being more sustainable and a more integrated approach.
Right. I mean, that absolutely touches on something I wanted to follow up on, also based on the questions that were submitted by participants in the webinar beforehand. And before I ask a little bit more on that topic of citizen participation, which is something you spoke eloquently about there, Santiago, and the need for it, I just want to remind people who are on the webinar, who have joined via Zoom, that if you have any questions for the panelists, we will soon go to a Q&A session with them. So please do type in your questions in the chat box that you will see there. And if you are watching on Facebook, you can also put your questions into the comment section, and I will direct those questions. If you have a specific person in mind who you would like to answer your question, please do mention that as well. But before we do that, while everybody's having time to think about their questions, I would like to go around the panelists and put a question to you that came in before the event, which is, what are successful tools in your experience of engaging citizens, especially vulnerable groups, in development process in cities? Whether that is specifically to do with the Sustainable Development Goals or wider urban development processes. If you have any examples of successful tools, things that have worked, I think our audience would be very keen to hear that. Perhaps we'll start with Aziza. If you could mention a couple of examples that OECD has come across. I mean, you already did mention a little bit there in your intro, but yeah, or specific characteristics of tools that are required to make them work. Thank you.
Now, that has become a very important issue, actually, if you look at what is happening and that geography of discontent and the rise of populism in a number of countries. This is often very much linked to the crisis of trust of citizens in the capacity of their governments to deliver very basic services. And we see a lot of innovation happening, somewhere more I would say pioneers, others are trying to catch up, but typically everything that has to do with participatory budgeting, we see a number of cities, that's the case of Paris, where they have a certain part of the budget that is ring-fenced for initiatives that are proposed, designed and implemented with different citizen groups, and including notably sometimes earmarks for vulnerable groups, and then we're talking about, you know, a few millions of euros every year. It's a very good way to co-produce and to secure the ownership for very local policies. Typically everything that has to do with crowdsourcing. This is a very important trend that is gaining traction now with big data. You can have very valuable tools to help understand the self-perception of citizens about their well-being and to catalyze innovative ideas. And I think new technologies, not so new actually, technologies help local decision makers be very much, on the ground and with the reality. And I think, you have a palette of these, including how you innovate in public procurement to allow for that type of flexibility. But what is very important, just to conclude on that for me, is to always be very clear about what we mean or what we can expect or what the result should be from citizen participation. Because the fact that you consult citizens or that you engage citizens does not always mean that you co-produce or co-decide with citizens. And I think one of the common mistakes that is made is the lack of clarification of how the inputs of these engagements are going to be used ultimately by the policymakers and those who are democratically elected to take the decisions. And so that's why it's very, it has become, a must-do. And it works very nicely when there is clarity upstream about what the decision-making line is and what the level of engagement is, from sharing information to raising awareness all the way through co-deciding, co-producing, and co-financing.
I think that's a very wise point, because if you just talk about citizen participation and tell people that they will be able to help make these decisions, and then they don't see how that process unfolds, I think it could be quite discouraging and actually really quite difficult to achieve unless you do set out and manage those expectations. Laurie, in your work at SDSN, have you done any research in particular on working with particular groups such as women? For example, I know there was a question that also came in about how women-led small businesses can contribute more effectively in the attainment of the SDGs, and that's a form of citizen sort of participation, or at least reaching out to women who are running such businesses.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, you're very right in that in order to localize the SDGs, you need local engagement. I mean, there's no question about that. And we, through our Sustainable Cities Initiative, we have been able to partner cities with a number of universities to do data collection. First of all, to help identify where are our pockets of inequality, what are our challenges particular to our city. We talk about leave no one behind with the Agenda 2030, and each city needs to look at this in their own context. And we've been fortunate to partner with some cities, Baltimore, San Jose, Los Angeles, and they are taking very thoughtful approaches to how they take what may be existing sustainability plans and look at them through the SDG lens, and very much bring in that social equality piece. When we were talking about Medellín, I thought of Baltimore, because this is a city that's also facing challenges with inequality and social issues. And in 2015, they set out to make themselves a more sustainable city. They have partnered with the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, Communities Without Borders International, Without Boundaries International, with the University of Baltimore, all in an attempt to quantify what really are their challenges, did a series of consultative listening meetings throughout the city, and they are also creating, Baltimore as well as a number of other cities, online portals where citizens can track progress that the city's making on the targets that they have identified for themselves as a city. So that's very much a way to engage the community, both in defining the problems, setting the targets, engaging universities in data collection and analysis, and then having everyone be a part of the accountability mechanisms that are in place. And certainly there's an opportunity for business to be a partner there, and small and medium enterprises gender equality. I mean, Detroit is a city that was able to move up in our index this year because of small and medium enterprises through women, and in the sharing economy, particularly in the US, there are a lot of opportunities there.
Excellent. Those are some really good examples. We have a couple of questions coming in on the Zoom chat now. Here's one, David from Quito. It dovetails a little bit with what we were talking about just now. He says it's a very long road from people to local governments and from there to central governments, and it takes time and effort and energy. Localizing the SDGs is about walking up that road from the bottom up and providing guidance and resources, knowledge, for example, as a top-down exercise. Does the panel have any ideas about how to speed up that process? Santiago, I'm wondering whether you might be able to answer that as a practitioner on the ground in Medellín. How do you try and make this happen fast enough in order to be able to make a difference, because it's not something that can be achieved overnight? What are the strategies that can be used in Colombia and beyond?
Yeah, thank you. And I quite agree with all of you about the importance of the national and the city approach, and especially what described right now in terms of what is being doing in Baltimore in terms of communities. But we can't forget the human dimension of all of this. It's also about individuals that we're talking about it. And in the case of violence prevention that we're working is clearly with cities that are affected. 50 cities out of the 50 more dangerous cities of the world, 44 are Latin American, 4 are New Orleans, Baltimore, Chicago, and St. Louis, Missouri, and the other 2 are Johannesburg and Cape Town. And when we look at that, we think we thought about what is in common, and clearly we figured out that it goes all down to individuals, the environment, the ecosystem, and where our communities are growing, and how they've been affected by violence, and how that violence and all the indicators around violence put the people really, really in the front of a major issue. So we come in with solutions very similar to the one described in Baltimore. We created the drone lab, and the idea was teaching people how to fly drones around their communities, and taking pictures from above, and for them to understand that the neighborhoods are part of a bigger picture, of a picture of a city and a country. We bigger pictures of those flights, and we discuss with the communities what are really the issues that are every single community are facing, trying to bring down the development goals to people's perspective, not to keep it in terms of the national and city perspective, but how can they be taken in a human dimension. And the outcome of that has been amazing, how people really are able to identify what are the causes and the roots of different problems, but also how can people participate creating new solutions. And as you all said, how can we use technology and innovation and social innovation to be able to tackle at the human scale and dimension the issues that we're facing right now, which are becoming more inclusive, bring more, and at the end of the day, create a better societies for the people and for the communities to really go forward. I think we all have to keep it in mind, because if we only focus in terms of nations and cities, and we don't focus and we don't bring opportunities in terms of the community, but also into the human scale, we're gonna miss a major part of the work that we have to do. And I would really like to link with Baltimore and other cities that are doing similar projects, because then you understand another dimension of the problem, but also the solution.
I think that that's an excellent point, that nowadays more and more cities are sharing their experiences and their knowledge and, you know, cutting corners, if you like, seeing what works and absolutely being able to put that into practice faster than if they had to do everything from scratch themselves. And obviously OECD and SDSN and organizations like that can help with that process, as can 100 Resilient Cities. I've had another question coming in, this time perhaps to touch a little bit on the subject of disasters. This is a question from Andrew Simmons asking if any of the initiatives that we've been talking about today intentionally try to link the Sendai framework indicators. Now, the Sendai framework is the global agreement on reducing the risk of disasters, and it includes indicators like substantially reducing the number of deaths and economic losses from disasters. And so Andrew would like to know, are there any linkages being made with that? I think perhaps disasters is something that we've touched on a little bit less so far today, but also in the questions that came in beforehand, we had people asking about how to address, you know, what's being done to address the risks of flooding. And obviously there's a whole host of disasters that can hit cities, including earthquakes. So I think, Aziza, I saw within your territorial approach that you have some linkages with Sendai. So perhaps you could fill us in a little bit on that and why is it important?
It's absolutely true. I think first there are a few targets in the SDG framework that link directly to disasters. And I think the whole reflection about upgrading, renewing and building more resilient infrastructure today is also a sort of way to move from crisis to risk management. And that's something that while it's being tracked is very important to keep an eye on. We've been showing that many actually countries, including the Netherlands, that are 2/3 below seawater and that have gone through major flood disasters in the past, or cities like Paris that has recently seen floodings in the Seine River, don't necessarily have their dikes up to the level, but most importantly, I think the question behind is how you engage also communities in the disaster recovery. And interesting examples in the US, for example, the Rebuild by Design initiative, where after a major disaster, we have an open discussion with all the neighborhoods and citizens and think together about the new city we want to build is a very interesting one. So typically, all the dimensions and every effort to measure sustainable development, the goals themselves, but sustainable development at large, need to include, of course, the disaster and resilience dimension, but also other global agendas, such as the COP, for example, and the Paris Agreement that is very much featured in the climate, but needs to be mainstreamed in all aspects of energy, of housing and retrofitting that can be done, of transport and mobility. And so new urban agenda, COP, Sendai frameworks are of course mainstreamed or need to be mainstreamed in any approach to assess the capacity of countries to fit for the future and recover from some of these disasters.
And Laurie, I'm interested to know what you found in your US cities SDG index on disasters and how their impacts can be limited, because obviously last September some US cities took a really bad pummeling from the hurricanes that came through and they're probably still recovering.
Yes, well, I mean, that is something that falls under Goal 11, resiliency planning. And this is one of several areas where we actually found it challenging to find comparable data on these points for these 100 metropolitan areas that we looked at. And this is a good opportunity to highlight, I guess, the very vast need for better data tracking, both in the US and globally, on a lot of these indicators and on a lot of the targets under these goals. That was something that we have on for some cities, not for others, but it's difficult to do a comparison really, as well as with some of our health and social equality indicators. So I really want to underscore the need in the US and globally. We have a whole other work stream just working on data for the SDGs that could better track that. And of course, in a developing country context, as we address the SDGs overall and things like poverty and housing, communities, low-income communities will be less vulnerable to some of the disasters that we're talking about. So it's all
That's a very good
much
point. Yes, that overall, if you improve people's resilience, then when a disaster comes along, it is easier to cope and to rebound from that disaster. Santiago, in your experience, what is Medellín doing about disaster risk? I know that you have earthquake risk, you probably have heat, risks of extreme heat, and perhaps flooding as well. Perhaps you could fill us in briefly on that issue.
When we decided to take a more community and human dimension scale approach, we look at the houses and how people's houses are vulnerable and exposed to different challenges. And clearly with communities, we identified that informality has put us in the center of a major challenge, which is most of our informal houses don't follow a construction codes, and their structures are not really strong enough to handle an earthquake or
I think we might have lost Santiago there briefly. Perhaps he will come back in a minute, but I can't hear him right now. Yes, that's a shame. I was looking forward to hearing what Medellín's doing on housing, but maybe we can bring him back in a second. I just wanted to go back to this issue of women and the SDGs, because we had another question come in that was similar to the one I mentioned before, which is how can you include women and women-led businesses more in cities? And the question says that they're actually hampered by structural and socioeconomic factors. I mean, in your experience of engaging with cities on the SDGs, do you find that women do have a good voice, or do you find that there is a need to go out and encourage women's participation? Maybe I can put that to you first, Aziza.
It's interesting because we had this discussion yesterday in the team. You know, we have at the OECD a network that we call OECD Champion Mayors for Inclusive Growth. It's about 50 mayors from cities of all sizes that have made inclusive growth a priority in their agenda. About 12% of those mayors are women. If you take mayors globally, about 5% are women. So we have a sample that is a bit representative, and it's true that we see a very strong push and influence from women-led cities, but that's also a general characteristic of the network, because this is the common denominator for including vulnerable groups in every possible stage of project design and decision. So there's certainly a response to that, which is ensuring that there is a representative leadership that can drive the crew in the different cities and that can role model and so on. But I think there's a related dimension to it, which is mainstreaming basically the gender dimension in every single public policy. If you look at the SDGs, you know, the impact of the gender gap was documented in many of them. We know that in villages and neighborhoods, when you don't have access to clean and affordable water, it's women that ultimately suffer because they have to go and supply it. It's the same for energy, for affordable housing, for transport. This has implications for every single public policy. So it's interesting to see how some regions or cities are including, for example, in the Basque country, in that piece of work that I mentioned about decentralized development cooperation, gender is a cross-cutting criteria and conditionality for every single cooperation project that the region does in Latin America and in other areas. It has as a basic condition that women ultimately need to be the drivers and beneficiaries of that. So I would say we have to work on both fronts. You can't have just a political leadership that is representative, but that's needed. You need to have this cross-cutting and mainstream lens in every public policy that will affect that gender gap.
Absolutely, Aziza, and in that way, I think that you can probably start to address those kind of structural inequalities that our audience member was referring to. So I'm aware that we don't have a great deal of time left. I think that we do have Santiago back now, which is good. So what I was going to say is, if I can, I'll go to Santiago in a second. But just to say that I would like to give you the opportunity, our panelists, to wrap up at the same time to give us a very brief overview of what you would like to see coming out of meetings like the high-level political forum. What kind of signs, what kind of signals and sort of political messages are useful or would be useful to you in your work? So if I could ask you all just to comment briefly on that. We'll go to Santiago now. And Santiago, if you could just fill us in also on what you were saying about housing, and then finish with what you would like to see coming out of the UN in July.
Well, definitely, I will really advocate for the measures on paying attention into a human scale and the community dimension. The development goals don't mean and won't mean anything if we don't really pay attention into the dimension of how communities could really participate at the heart of the change. And that means from their houses, from their communities, from their children, from their leadership, how they can really influence global leaders like mayors and presidents, but also practitioners like us, to be able to include their voices and their ideas on social innovation to tackle all the challenges that we're facing right now today in terms of social and human development, and to reduce the gap of inequalities and inequities that we're facing right now.
So a top-level message about the importance of citizens and having their voices heard in the SDGs process, so that it's not just all about government messages and promises, but real-life action on the ground, and the importance of facilitating that. Laurie, you may also have a comment on the women's participation question that I raised before. So if we could maybe hear your thoughts on that, and also on what would be useful to you in your work coming out of the high-level political forum.
Yes, thanks, Megan. Yeah, I did want to make a few points on the gender issue. First of all, I was fortunate to participate as an observer in the US Conference of Mayors meeting last month, and I could tell you there are many very competent and motivated mayors in the US, and many women among them. So these are certainly people that are going to be taking local leadership in their communities. But going back to the data issue, one of the things we wanted to track was women in local political offices, and we could not find comparable data for that in the US. We recently did an index just focused on African countries, and we were looking for indicators related to sexual violence or women's ability to own land. We could not find comparable data on this. So I have to really underscore again the need. We have to know what we're looking at to really be able to work towards the SDGs. And in developing countries, I mean, women, even in modest means, in Haiti, there's a program where women are involved in marketing cook stoves, cleaner cook stoves at the market, and microfinance helps them to do that. There are small-scale sanitation solutions for low-income countries that women in their communities can be involved in helping to support. So I think there are opportunities there. So for the HLPF, you know, we would like to see countries really taking accountability and really systemizing this into their institutions, into their budgeting, into their planning processes, and working with cities and working all the way down the line to communities. And for communities and citizens to hold their governments accountable and ask for these accountability mechanisms, online tracking and online tools, where data is presented, because it's really through these types of accountability mechanisms and partnerships that we're going to move forward.
Absolutely. So there is a real need for extra information, for more data, for a better understanding of what the problems are in order to be able to build those solutions. Some very clear points made there, Laurie. Aziza, I believe that you're going to be announcing formally your territorial approach to the SDGs at the high-level political forum, the one that you were talking about at the start. What kind of reaction would you like to see to that? What kind of interest are you hoping to excite there?
Well, we'll be launching indeed the project on the 13th of July. Anyone willing to join is most invited to contact us. I would like to see the discussion shift from the advocacy of the past 2-3 years on the road to developing the agenda around the role of cities and regions, which I think now is taken for granted, so the who and the what, if I can say so, to a discussion that is more on the how. And how we make that happen. And for this, I think first we need to acknowledge that it's not starting now. The SDGs are not an end in themselves, they're a tool for decision makers to care about people in the end and deliver better outcomes for citizens, as this was said earlier. So the SDGs are a means to an end. The policies have long been there, and there's been a lot done already to tackle very practical issues of affordable housing, land use, climate, solid waste, water, and so on. So it's a tool now to think that systematically and holistically. But I think the discussion, I hope, will now shed more light on what is needed to get there. And for me, there are 3 things at least. The first one is the discussion on the fiscal capacity and the decentralization levels that can give certain autonomy for cities to deliver. There's certainly a discussion on the level of democracy and to what extent, and that goes to our discussion about citizen participation and accountability. We can have this shift from top down to bottom up in the different cities, north and south alike. And there is, I think, also an exposure to international trade and globalization benefits at large, which I think needs to be recalled because it has largely also contributed to lift people out of poverty when properly done. And I think at times where multilateralism is questioned, it's good to recall the benefits that cities are in the global value chains and that there's from globalization some positive things to be taken. So I'd like to see the discussion shift on the how. We'll keep you informed on the outcomes.
Very good. Thank you so much to all our panelists today. We've run out of time. I think we've had a very good wide-ranging discussion with lots of practical examples of what's actually happening on the ground in different places in order to implement the SDGs and what tools are available to help cities and regions do that. I think one of the main messages I'm getting from today's discussion ahead of the high-level political forum is that it's time to roll up our sleeves, really work out in different locations the priorities, listen to people, hear what they think needs to be done and work out ways in which to do that. So I do hope that we'll get more direction on that in July from the political leaders, but there will also be a lot of people working on the margins or within that forum in order to give more information about what they're doing. So please stay tuned. We will be trying to write about some of those things. So do come back and visit Zilient.org when you can. And we will also be putting up there a write-up and a video of this discussion today, which we hope you will share with your network. So thank you very much indeed for joining. Next month, we'll be focusing on resilience in islands, just to give you a quick heads up. But for today, thank you very much. And once again, thank you to our panelists for your time and insights. Goodbye for now.